My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm Tolkien Geek, and 2 videos prior to this one I did a deleted scenes video where I talked about the episode where Merry along with the riders of Rohan meet the Druidine, or the Woses, the wild men of the woods. This never makes it into any of the movie adaptations, although it is covered in at least one radio adaptation, the Mind's Eye / NPR adaptation, but we never get to see it on the screen. And it's a really interesting episode, and the reason I'm doing this video and follow-up more or less is because there is more information on these strange people that Merry observes and Theoden meets in the woods. And that information is found in the Unfinished Tales volume, and it's not a lot of information, but it's definitely worth going over. So let's see what we can learn about these enigmatic folk. So in the Unfinished Tales, the section on the Druidine, as they're called, is broken up into 2 parts. One is kind of just a general history and description, and then there is a short story about them. The description begins with a history going back to the days of the Silmarillion and talking about the first coming of men into the West. And if you don't know what I'm talking about here, you can check out my Silmarillion playlist, and each one of those videos is titled, the same exact way that the chapters in the Silmarillion are titled. So the chapter of men, and then the one of men coming into the West, that'll get you a background onto this. But there are 3 peoples that come as men into the West initially, and these are the ones that the elves call the Edain. And among these are the folk of Beor, as they're called, the house of Hador, and the people of Haleth. Now, the people of Haleth are kind of different from the others. They've never really mingled with the others. They were always kind of separate and apart, and it tells us in this particular section a little bit about their differences, how they're a smaller group. They're very good at warriors, but they don't tend to, they live apart in small groups, and they also have a unique aspect that a lot of their warriors are women. But one of the other unique things about this particular group of men that come into the West is the fact that among them lives this other strange group of men that they call the Druid, and therefore that's where the elves end up calling them the Druidine. They count them among the Edain because they are, allied with the people of Haleth, but they're not the same as the people of Haleth, and it's unknown what their origins are, but they came with the people of Haleth and mostly lived among the people of Haleth as far as the history goes. So then it gets into a little bit of the Druidine themselves, and it tells us, that they're very few in number, didn't really live very long, and it gives a description as far as their appearance too, which I'll read here. To the eyes of elves and other men, they were unlovely in looks. They were stumpy, some 4 foot high, but very broad, with heavy buttocks and short, thick legs. Their wide faces had deep-set eyes with heavy brows and flat noses, and grew no hair below their eyebrows, except in a few men, who were proud of the distinction, a small tail of black hair in the midst of the chin. So these guys are short, they're very thick, stumpy, they're almost dwarf-like in a lot of ways. But one of the other interesting things that we get in this passage about them is that they're very good at tracking. They're very good at, basically all kinds of woodcraft. They're also just about as knowledgeable about living things as elves are, which is, surprising for, a folk of men. They also do a lot of, when they come into Beleriand and the availability of metal tools and such things is a little more widespread, it tells us they become much more interested in carving figures of men and other things. And in fact, one of the interesting things it tells us about that is that they end up carving a lot of figures of orcs in positions like they're fleeing in terror, and they also make lots of statues that look like themselves. And they use some of these as kind of like warding stones. They kind of put them at boundaries and whatnot, and it's like when the orcs come and they see one of those, are like, I'm not going in there, I know what that means. So their renown as being woodcrafty hunters and trackers and whatnot is really, really well known even among the orcs. And it even tells us that they can track by their scent, and it says that they can smell an orc to windward further than another man could see them. So they're very unusual for sure. A final element that is interesting about this is that the Druidine are also very good at remaining basically motionless for long periods of time, and they could endure hardship in a lot of ways that most men couldn't. They could be out in the weather, they could be hungry, just doesn't matter. They can just sit there very still. And there's a brief story that's part of this where this one Druid makes a statue of his father who had recently died, and then he sits there right next to it in kind of just meditating. And another man, not of the Druidine, passes by and thinks they're both statues. And he keeps going, and then wherever he was going to, he comes back, and he's passing by, and he sees that they're still there. And he's tired or whatever, so he, knowing that orcs probably aren't going to, mess around anywhere where there's these statues, he's like, I'm just going to take a rest. And he leans up against the back of one of them. And then next thing you know, he hears this voice saying, I don't mind you like leaning up against me, but I'm getting kind of tired. Could you move? He was leaning up against the live one the whole time. And because of this skill and this ability to just be totally motionless for long periods of time, they were very valued as guards by the people of Holith, and the families would very much value having one of these as, kind of attached to their family as somebody who would guard them, because they could basically remain unseen by being motionless. And also it even says that their watchful gaze could be felt so intently that it would feel like a threat to somebody even who didn't know they were there. And they didn't miss anything. They would never miss, like, the smallest animal passing by. They saw everything. So very dangerous to have as enemies, certainly. And it even says that in terms of their, their emotional side, you might say, their laugh is very surprising considering what they're like, and very infectious. This is actually, I mentioned in my previous video on that episode in the Lord of the Rings. This is where that comes from, actually, not in the Lord of the Rings. I kind of imported this in that video. But also their anger is basically undying, which is another thing that's kind of like dwarves for them. But they don't really show it as much in their face. Their features are mostly impassive, it tells us. They don't really show much of any emotion in their face. So it's really interesting how these people are described. Now, the longer story that gets included in this section is really interesting, and it's actually about this idea of the Druidine being guards. And it tells the story of this one family who had a guard, and the guard, basically tells them, my brother has been wounded. And you get the idea even that some of this stuff is they almost have a psychic connection with each other, because I don't think there was a specific message that came to him. But at any rate, he ends up telling the family that he's living with that he has to go tend to his brother. And this is at a dangerous time because a bunch of orcs had been marauding in the area, and so they were like really scared, if you leave us, we're going to be in trouble. And he says, well, I'm going to leave a watchstone here, basically one of the Druidine that looks like it's just kind of sitting there still, and put my power in it and it'll protect you. So he goes, and sure enough, a group of orcs does come through the area, sets fire to a bunch of the woods around, and then as the man of the house is getting ready to like shoot down orcs with his bow, he notices that a Droog is actually attacking them, like hitting them from behind and beating them up. And next thing you know, he jumps out, from his house getting ready to help, but the Druidine and the orcs have all gone, and so he just kind of stays at his house. And he also saw outside that the Droog had been like stamping the fire out with his own feet and things like that. He also notices that the statue is gone. So anyway, the next day, the Druid came back and said, well, I have good news. I got to my brother in time. I got venom out of his wound. He's going to be fine. And then the guy tells him, well, while you were gone, this orc attack happened, and the watchstone you set here is gone. I'm guessing that's orc work. And he said, well, let me have a look around, and I'll tell you what I think. And he looks around and he finds the watchstone, and it's like sitting on top of a dead orc off in the underbrush somewhere. And then he ends up taking bandages off of his feet, and he has like burn wounds on his feet. And he says that he felt this like the day before, which would have been after all of the excitement happened at this house. And he said, well, you know, if you impart some of your own power to a thing, you have to take a share, and it hurts. So it's like the watchstone that he placed there actually came alive and was like embodied almost by his own spirit and transferred some of what it felt to him, which is really bizarre. It's one of the most bizarre things in Middle-earth in terms of things like magic. So it's a really interesting story about that, and it connects too to the Lord of the Rings, because these watchstones would have been much like what Merry saw in Rohan that were called the Pukelmen by the people of Rohan and the road up to Dunharrow. That's most of the information that can be found on the Druidine and the Unfinished Tales, but there is a section of notes at the end, and one of them is really fascinating because it says that they were actually among the people who were permitted to sail west to Numenor before it sank, of course. And this gets really interesting because it even connects it to the tale of Aldarion and Erindis, which I covered in a previous video, and I can link to that in the description. But the interesting thing about it is it says that during the days of Aldarion and Erindis, and as sailing back to Middle-earth got more and more common, they began to feel a little bit uneasy and started to, one by one, make their way back to Middle-earth as well. And they would, you know, they weren't really seafaring types, and so this was really unusual. And by the time Sauron eventually came to the island much later in the Second Age, they had pretty much all gone, because they kind of saw the writing on the wall way earlier, and it all made their way back to Middle-earth. So that's a really interesting kind of side note to all of this, which is, it's really fascinating how Tolkien tried to connect them to other stories that he was writing about Numenor in the Second Age. It would have been interesting to see if he had really developed that, where that could have gone. That's most of what you can get about the Druidine. There's a few other scattered notes and whatnot, but most of it is not super interesting in and of itself. If you want to get the whole story, of course, pick up the Unfinished Tales or check it out if you've already got it. So, that is the Druidine and what little we know about them. It would have been really interesting to see Tolkien write more stories about these people, because they are a fascinating bunch. One thing I did forget to mention is that Tolkien was at pains to distinguish the fact that they are not really related to hobbits or dwarves, despite their similarities to both. So they really are a distinct group, despite, you know, what they may seem to be connected to in other peoples. But it's a really fascinating, you know, group of people, and it would have been interesting to see how things might have gone if he had gotten more time to really invest in their history. But if you did enjoy this video and learning what you could learn about them, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, you can do that here. Don't forget to click the bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.